everyone, and welcome to a very special episode of The Point. I'm Cara Santa Maria, the senior science correspondent for the Huffington Post. And today I want to really talk about something that it seems like neither of the major political parties really want to get into, and that's the science behind climate change. You know, I'm going to be honest, my background is in neuroscience. I think, get confused the way that a lot of, viewers today probably do when I start to try and separate fact from fiction when it comes to climate change. So I have this great panel here today that hopefully is going to help me out, and we're going to start with Bill Patzert, a climatologist and oceanographer with NASA's JPL, that's the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, the same lab that landed the Curiosity rover on Mars, yeah. His research is aimed at understanding how our planet's changing climate is impacting society now and what the future holds for us all. So thanks for being here, Bill.
Pleasure.
We've also got Tammy Bang Luu, Associate Director of the Labor Community Strategy Center and co-host of Voices from the Front Lines on KPFK, our local Pacifica station. She also just returned literally yesterday from an international climate change meeting in Thailand.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for being here. And finally, we've got Andrea Robinson, the founder and director of ARC Sustainability, a Los Angeles-based environmental and corporate social responsibility consulting firm. Ooh, that's hard to say. Yeah, responsible for, among other efforts, greening the 2008 DNC.
Hi.
Hi. All right, so thanks so much for joining us on the panel. We've got 3 great points this week. In a bit, we're going to hear from Stanford University professor and Nobel Prize winner Christopher Field about why there's hope for dealing with the inevitable changes being wrought by global warming. And later, Naomi Oreskes, who's a science historian at the University of California, San Diego, is going to explain the true source of the anti-science opposition to climate change. That'll be really interesting. But first, we're going to get a climate report from the man the Boston Globe has called the nation's leading environmentalist, author, journalist, and 350.org founder, Bill McKibben. Let's take a look.
Hello, this is Bill McKibben, founder of 350.org. Here's my point. One, I made it more length and with more precision in an article this summer in Rolling Stone that went kind of unexpectedly viral. Look, the most conservative scientists and governments on Earth have agreed that 2 degrees is as much as we should even contemplate increasing the temperature of the planet, since 1 degree has already melted half the Arctic. Second, we know about how much more carbon we can burn and stay below 2 degrees, have any hope of staying below. It's about 560 gigatons more of CO2. Third number, we also know, thanks to the work of a series of financial analysts, that the fossil fuel industry and the countries that kind of operate like fossil fuel companies, think Venezuela, have 5 times that much already in their reserves, 2,795 gigatons of carbon, i.e., you can have a healthy business model for the fossil fuel industry or a healthy planet, but you can't have both, i.e., it is time to rein that industry in and keep most of that coal and oil and gas underground. It's going to be difficult and expensive, but at this point, the laws of physics and chemistry demand that we do nothing less.
So I wanted to have Bill McKibben make this point because I recently read that article that he referenced in Rolling Stone. I think it was in the August 2012 issue, but that would have come out in July. And it's fascinating and horrifying at the same time. So, in a bit, I want to talk about how we can realistically try and curb these carbon emissions and rein in the fossil fuel industry. But before that, I want to talk about where the science is today with regard to global warming. So, Bill, what is McKibben talking about with reference to this 560 gigatons of CO2 versus the 2,795 gigatons? Where do these numbers come from? What do they mean?
Well, maybe I can give you the short story here. Over the past 200 years, we've done an extreme makeover, not only on the planet, but on the planet's atmosphere. In the 19th century, we had the great agricultural revolution, where we started clearing the forests. And of course, that immediately put the entire carbon on the planet out of balance, because one of the great sinks are the great forests. And then in the 20th century, we had this great industrial revolution where we got ourselves addicted to fossil fuels, gas, coal, oil. And now the 560 gigatons, that's billions of tons. of carbon in the atmosphere that we're emitting into the atmosphere right now has essentially changed the fundamental nature of our climate. And over the past 130 years, the average temperature on the planet has actually increased 1.6 degrees Fahrenheit, or the 1 degree Celsius that Bill was talking about. All right? And all that excess carbon has essentially made the planet warmer. And all that warmth, basically 90% of it is being absorbed in the oceans. So the unequivocal proof is that global sea level has actually risen 8 inches in the last century and a half. That's an awful lot, all right? And
ask any guy, 8 inches is a lot.
Yeah. So setting the tone for the show early. Well, I mean, before we kind of move on to, I think, a lot of the, the systematic proof or evidence, I guess we should say, that deniers will try to refute, I kind of want to back it up because I think a lot of people don't really understand the link between CO2 and warmth. Why does, what is a greenhouse gas? Why does CO2 and also methane actually make the planet warmer? How does that work?
Well, if you start pumping these greenhouse gases, methane and CO2 in the atmosphere, they have a high heat capacity. They tend to grab heat. They capture it, and they capture it for a long time. And that heat radiates back onto the planet. And so we're living in a warmer world. And good evidence for that is disappearing glaciers and ice sheets all over the planet.
Yeah, you can YouTube that. I mean, just Google and see these horrific videos of people on vacation, of scientists doing surveys, and just watching the ice kind of crumbling before their eyes in cold months even.
So I was just recently in Thailand where the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC, was having its intersessionals. And I was talking to some Bangladeshi peasants that are part of La Via Campesina, which is 400 million members wide across the world of farmers, peasants,
wow.
La Via Campesina. And what they're saying is, by 2050, the sea level rise will have been so great that a third of their country would have moved in. We're talking about 30 million people impacted.
Yeah,
right?
Bangladesh is one of the lowest, total kind of land masses, right? I mean, this is a country that's going to be one of the first.
And then
that's already
about
affected.
Environmental refugees. I mean, that's an issue that we haven't really fully addressed as a sort of a side issue of climate change, which isn't. It's going to be huge. It already is.
50% of the world's population lives within 50 miles of a coastline. All right.
We got whole islands like Tuvalu and the Association of Small Island States that are saying in less than 30 years they're going to be submerged underwater. They made a petition to countries like Australia to take in. They're trying to figure out what to do with their whole population, and they got denied. So there's a lawsuit right now charging the United States inside the World Court around the level of emissions the U.S. emits, and because whole countries are going to be impacted. We're not just talking about the hottest month in July. We're talking about devastation across the world.
Well, and that kind of reminds me of a question that I want to ask, and I was going to ask it later, but I think that you gave me a good segue into that, which is, I was reading up on this, and I was reading an article, I think in Science, about kind of when is it going to be the point in time where individuals or where groups of people, class action, can actually sue the fossil fuel industry? When can we say without a shadow of a doubt that there is a significant link between the actions of the coal and fossil fuel industries and the warming planet that downstream is causing, for example, extreme weather events? Because we're seeing victims of these extreme weather events wanting to sue these fossil fuel industries.
Well, at this point, the evidence is unequivocal if you want to take it to court. Rising sea levels, a warmer climate, melting glaciers and ice sheets. For instance, in Southeast Asia, the great reservoirs of water for most of Southeast Asia, which is almost 2/3 of the world's population, are the glaciers in the Himalayas. And they're retreating at a dramatic rate. The great rivers, the Yellow River, the Mekong River, the Brahmaputra, all these great rivers, really 2/3 of the world's population is dependent on those glaciers. They are definitely disappearing.
Yeah.
And the impact's going to be felt at home. I mean, you're looking at droughts in the Midwest. James Hansen just did a report where he linked 3 of the biggest kind of the Texas-Oklahoma drought that happened last year, impacting thousands of people and food crops. The ones
it's a
that
new
happened.
Dust Bowl.
Yeah,
I mean, it's frightening.
And so there's direct links to climate change. And so we're not just talking about, you know, Bangladesh, Tuvalu,
far away places with far away people. Yeah,
the Midwest.
And I think that's something that people hopefully are going to start kind of making a connection with, because so far, I think in the minds of so many Americans or so many people living in Western countries, kind of the effects of global climate change aren't in their own backyards.
They're somewhere
yet.
else.
They're somewhere else. Exactly.
It's
like they're affecting kind of the people that they don't know.
Exactly.
You know, they're affecting the poor people in the places that they're not in touch
and names
with.
they can't pronounce.
Exactly.
I mean, but it's not. It's here. It's now. It's happening. And actually, I actually am of the thinking that the conversation about it, whether it's real or not, is over. It's not even worth having anymore. It's very clear. Science has agreed. People are feeling it now. And now that we're feeling it, it's kind of on the late side, isn't it? But maybe that's enough to spur people into doing something when it's in your own backyard.
Well, and that's really the question. I think that what we're talking about as the kind of expected results of global climate change, obviously as the world gets warmer across the board, and we're not just talking about in certain pockets, but on average across the globe, the world is getting warmer. We know that the oceans are going to get larger because warm water expands, and also because we're losing a lot of glacial coverage, right? We also know that the oceans are going to get to be more acidic because they're going to be absorbing and sinking.
They're already 30% more acidic.
Exactly. They're sinking that extra CO2. CO2 in water forms carbonic acid. We've got more acidity in the oceans. And we know about droughts. We know about floods. But what about these extreme weather events that seem like they're a little harder to link? You know, I think a lot of times the arguments that I have with deniers have to do with climate versus weather, because it can be used on kind of both sides of this, and I shouldn't even call it a debate because it's not a debate, but they're used both by climate scientists who are trying to describe some of the deadly ramifications, but they're also used by deniers to say, oh, but we had a really cold winter, so obviously there's no global warming. But what about hurricanes and tornadoes and, you know, tsunamis? Are these things directly linked to global climate change?
Well, I'm supposed the expert here. I think you have to be very careful about linking extreme weather with climate change, all right? But one thing is clear, the impacts have been greater over the last half century. And just to add a complication here, why is that? And the answer is population, all right? Now remember, before we started adding all this carbon into the atmosphere, there were only 500 million people on the planet. Now we're over 7 billion. So every time there is a natural disaster, if the Great Tsunami in Indonesia had happened 100 years ago, the death toll would have been 30,000. This time it was 300,000, all right? Now the same thing is true for hurricanes, tornadoes, and other extreme weather events. In my lifetime, the population of the Earth tripled. All right? And so you have this explosive population growth on top of climate change, which essentially exacerbates the thing and starts to push it to these tipping points, which really send everything out of control. But as we talk about climate change, we should talk about population.
But I kind of want to come back around to what McKibben was saying before we move on to the next segment and talk about this 2-degree figure, this 2 degrees Celsius. Why is this a tipping point? What does this mean that we're already more than halfway there? What's going to happen after we reach 2%? And have we already kind of crossed that threshold?
We're 3/4 of the way there, according to McKibben's numbers, anyway. And so that's, if we stopped everything today, there's still about 50 years more of carbon in the atmosphere to do its, you know, its work. So,
and that's if we stopped. Literally,
exactly. And then you have these feedback loops, like what's happening in the Arctic, you know, ice sheet right now. Basically, methane is now being released from underneath it, and then you have these feedback cycles, which make everything exceptionally worse. And you know, scientists are conservative in general, but to predict what those feedback cycles are going to be and know exactly what they're going to be, we don't. That's why things have sped up so quickly.
I mean, even the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is the United Nations panel, their predictions are drastically lower. I mean, the acidity rate that she's talking about, and the methane release, they didn't project that for like 20 years out. But one of the things is this 2 degrees Celsius, and maybe Bill, you could talk a bit more about that. That's a standard that got set in basically the Congress of Parties, the UNFCCC meeting in Copenhagen and then reinforced in Cancun. Actually, what hundreds of countries are saying, they're saying 1.5 degrees Celsius, that at 2 degrees Celsius, Africa is going to be boiling. And so what we're already pushing that 2 degrees as the tipping point is already drastically dangerous.
And we've already surpassed 1 degree Celsius.
We've already surpassed 1 degree.
So, I mean, we're, like you said, if we cut all global carbon emissions right now, we would already be, you know, encroaching on that 1.5. I mean, I've seen estimates, depending on who's writing, from, you know, 1.5 being a critical tipping point to 2 to 3, and kind of, you know, we may be on track to see a global climate change of 6 degrees Celsius or more in the next 100, 200 years. But you know, we don't really know, right? We don't really know what these percent points are going to, or how these percentage points are going to affect us. But it seems like climate scientists across the globe have kind of agreed, right, that this 2 degrees Celsius is a good number to stick to, and that it shouldn't be changed. I know a lot of people are saying, oh, just jack it up a little, and then we can meet all of our demands.
To be clear, James Hansen of NASA was saying 350 parts per million. We're talking about 1.5 degrees Celsius as this tipping point. So that whole other 0.5 that's been edged out, it means real things for whole countries and peoples, right?
And we haven't surpassed 300 parts per million in the last, what, 10,000 years?
Well, here's the facts. 200 years ago, the carbon in the atmosphere was at 280 parts per billion, all right, per million, all right? Presently, we're approaching 400 parts per billion. All right, that's a lot. So man-made global warming is unequivocal. All right, global warming is irreversible.
Yeah.
All right. So what we're really talking about here is setting what I call a threshold of 2 degrees, which is one scary threshold. All right. And how far beyond that do we go? So the issue really here is, does the planet want to get hit in the head with a hard ball, or do we want to get hit in the head with a beach ball? All right?
We're going to get hit in the head either way, it sounds like.
That's right.
All right, so before we move on to the next segment, I want to just kind of show you guys a graphic of what we can expect to see as the planet warms in the next few hundred years. In terms of health and wellness, we're going to see decreased water availability. We're going to see increased droughts and decreased food production, increased malnutrition and disease, increased mortality from extreme weather events, and increased damage from floods and storms. In the oceans, we're going to see increased coral bleaching, which is a decrease in healthy coral reefs, which is, you know, devastating to this large ecosystem. We're going to see increased ocean acidification and warmer, larger oceans, which lead to sea level rise and loss of because of loss of sea ice. And also, just in terms of the global ecology, we're going to see an increased extinction risk for many species. And I keep saying going to see, but we're already seeing many of these things right now. Loss of coastal wetlands and loss of home and habitat due to coastal flooding. So
it's not a pretty picture.
It's not a pretty picture at all. We're going to take a quick break, so go ahead and leave comments below, and we'll be right back with more of The Point. Hi everyone, welcome back to The Point and our special episode all about climate change. Our next point is going to come from Christopher Field, a professor of biology and environmental earth system science at Stanford University. He's the founding director of the Carnegie Institution's Department of Global Ecology, and by the way, a Nobel Prize winner. Let's take a look.
My name's Chris Field. I'm the director of the Carnegie Institution's Department of Global Ecology. And here's my point. We know that climate's changing. We have high confidence that people are causing it. And we have high confidence that in the absence of action, climate will continue to change in the future. There are going to be a few people and a few places where these consequences of the climate change are beneficial, but for most people and most places, the consequences will be harmful. But there are many things we can do. In fact, what I want to talk about today are the opportunities for dealing effectively with climate change. And those opportunities fall into two big categories. In the category of adaptation, dealing effectively with the climate changes that can't be avoided, there are wonderful opportunities for being better prepared for extremes, for dealing more effectively with extremes as they do occur, and for recovering more rapidly for building societies that are fundamentally resilient and that are empowering to people everywhere. We have lots of evidence that adaptation can be not only cost-effective, efficient, and effective, but it can also lead to a stronger, more robust, more resilient society. The other big category of things we can do is in the area of mitigation, preventing climate change that can be prevented. And the thing that people really need to understand is that there's a vast opportunity to create new industries, new businesses, new opportunities for creating wealth by building a society that's grounded in renewable energy and not in the fossil industries that have essentially used the atmosphere as a waste dump over the last 100 years. For more on what I'm telling you, the best source is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, ipcc.ch.
So I have to say that Christopher seems pretty optimistic in that video, and I'm not so it's hard for me to stay optimistic, but I want to ask you specifically, Tammy, you know, you've been all over the world. What kinds of these kind of adaptation efforts or even these mitigation efforts have you seen in indigenous peoples in these kind of island cultures?
Well, I mean, I was just at the United Nations conference, the World Summit on Sustainable Development. It's real plus 20 years since the founding of the Earth Summit. I mean, what communities, both indigenous and a lot of different communities, are saying is first we need deep emissions cuts. So particularly from the United States, I mean, Bill will say that the main issues is population. I would say it's consumption and production. It's capitalism. I mean, and what that's produced, the level of cars in the road. He's been talking about our cell phones, right? So we really need to think about how do we reduce consumption and production.
He's been talking about our cell phones?
I was like, really?
He's been talking before the show? What did he say?
There's way too many of them. We can get to the difference between systemic action and individual action. But so the first thing is we do really need deep cuts,
yes.
right?
But are we seeing those deep cuts
and
taking
not what's
place?
on the table. So what's on the table, we're talking about maybe 13, 17%. People are saying 80% reduction based on 1990 standards. So
we're seeing 13 to 17% on the table?
What's on the table. And a lot of that is actually false by the time you add in. So the second thing, if we want deep cuts, the second thing a lot of indigenous countries were saying is no to market-based solutions. So one of the big, with the Waxman-Markey bill that didn't pass, right, was cap and trade. We're actually looking at it possibly with AB 32 in California passing implemented in California.
You just said a lot of big words and letters that I'm not sure I understand. What are you referring to for those watching who don't live in California?
So basically, let's cap the amount of emissions, and then they'll be able, if they don't meet that actual cap, be able to trade in whatever they don't use. But there's a cap and trade system in European nations, right? It hasn't shown to work. There was a cap and trade system that we implemented called Reclaim for sulfur in California. It actually increased sulfur, right? So cap and trade isn't working. Market-based solutions aren't working. And
we're still seeing a political base that thinks that that's going too far.
That's going far. So, but what is possible? So Bill McKibben is saying, let's look at the fossil fuel industry, and that's what Chris Fields is both saying. We give hundreds, I think they're saying in the next 10 years, $100 billion worth of basically fossil fuel welfare to oil, gas, and coal companies, right? We can, one, cut the subsidies and use that for renewables. At the Labor Community Strategy Center, we house the Bus Riders Union, and one of the big proponents is the United States. 32% of our greenhouse gas emissions is in the transportation sector. 60% of that, right, is in automobiles. And so we're talking about 20% of all our greenhouse gas emissions in the United States coming from automobiles. So one great kind of adaptation we can do or mitigation is to replace the level of cars. Moratorium on highways and roads. Like, let's really build mass transportation systems, encourage collective modes of public transportation.
So but what we're talking about are massive governmentally imposed regulations, right?
I mean, this is
not something that's going to happen if we allow kind of the free market to run the show here. This is something where we need specific governmental regulations because people are not going to choose to do these things on their own.
Interestingly enough, a lot of the companies around the world are asking governments to do something. They're at like 185 leaders of companies actually wrote their governments and said, do something to this 2C level. right? So because government is largely asleep in terms, especially the American government is asleep in terms of doing anything, because it's uncomfortable and it's going to take some real systemic change. But beyond all that, we're going to have to look at it as a system. We're really still you and me, my country, your country, my tax base, yours. It's not going to work that way. This is one planet. We're all on it. I don't care where the dividing lines are.
Yeah. I mean, look, we all have individual responsibility. I like recycling. I think we all need to figure out how to reduce our own carbon footprint.
But is that enough?
That's not enough.
I mean,
the kind of change we're talking about, we need systemic change. So
yeah, this kind of going green trend that we're seeing in Western countries, and I mean, honestly, I'm going to call it a trend. Like, I feel like I'm doing my part because I bring my reusable bag to the grocery store. Is that really cutting carbon emissions? Am I actually affecting global climate change?
No, this is what I'm always, because I deal with corporate social responsibility a lot and individual action and events, what people are doing at events. Yes, it's not gigaton scale we're talking about what individuals are going to do, but collectively it does have an impact. And beyond that, it changes people's thinking about it. So even though it seems like such a ridiculously lame notion to bring your, I'm really going to change things by reusing my cup, for example.
It is easy to do, so
but
I do it.
You know what?
You know?
People still struggle with something that we consider easy right here at this table.
Yeah.
So that's what I'm saying. If you say that's just not enough, it's a trend, forget about it, nobody's going to care. Also, right now, it's already pretty hard to get people to pay attention to this, the media to even cover it.
And also, it's a choice still. It's not something where they don't have any other options.
No,
you
which is
still
why
get a plastic bag at the grocery store.
But you need government. You really need the large scale that government can achieve to do something, and that's not happening. But you need the nexus of NGO and business together to do something collectively. But individual actions, to me, do very much matter because we're still voting populace.
We're in a battle here of human nature against Mother Nature. And now I do a lot of talking with young kids in the schools, and they get it. The kids really get it, all right? And I always tell them that people make fun of me, but I say, real men use reusable bags. So when I go to Ralph's, I carry my bags in there.
Ralph's, by the way, is Kroger in California, if you didn't know that.
Right. So I think at a grassroots level, all the small changes, I'm a little older than the three of you, but all the small changes we make at a grassroots level over the last decade or two are starting to make a big difference. And as Andrea said, it's a mind change.
It is.
It's a mind change. And of course, it has to go from the bottom up, but from the top down too.
Yeah.
And we do need government regulations. And so I remember my favorite car was the 1959 Cadillac Eldorado convertible, white with a pink interior, all right? And I think that got 11 miles per gallon.
Nice.
All right? All right? But now, people brag about 40 miles per gallon, and we're aiming for 50 miles a gallon.
That's true.
Right?
There is kind of a
there,
cool factor
right.
to being green.
Yeah, and more than that, gas is a hell of a lot more expensive than it used to be. And so these things are happening.
But the thing
now,
is,
of course, they should happen more rapidly.
Gas is still pretty damn cheap.
And in the U.S.
I mean,
it
that's
is.
the thing.
Yeah.
In the United States, even though people say $4.50 a gallon, that's insane. That's affordable for a middle-class family.
As I drive my military vehicle to the supermarket, I mean, if we actually had, a reduction in our subsidies for the fossil fuel industry, especially in the U.S., you would see a shift in what Americans do and what they purchase and how they walk somewhere. We even saw it in the recession to some degree. I mean, the U.S. subsidizes fossil fuels to the tune of $72 billion, whereas renewables get $12 billion. So that needs to be actually switched. That's what we need to do, and we need to do it now. And we actually have the political will and technology, I think, know how to do it. We're just not doing it.
You think we have the political will?
No, I think we need to.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, it ain't there.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, let me say this. I think that some candidates in some political parties have more of a political role than others, all right? So it's really important that you plant trees and you drive a Prius. Probably the most important thing you do in the next couple of months, in the next decade, is who you vote for.
Yeah. I mean, but we'll talk about it in the next segment, but neither party, the Republican nor the Democrats, are really talking about the kind of systemic change that we need.
Or even talking about it almost at all, truthfully.
Yeah,
almost at all.
That's true, that's true. And on that note, let's go ahead and take a break, and we'll move on. After the break, we're going to hear from Naomi Oreskes. Don't forget to leave comments below. We'll see you in a bit. Hi everyone, welcome back to The Point. This is our special episode all about climate change. Our final point today is coming to us from the University of California, San Diego's Naomi Oreskes. Let's take a look.
Hi, I'm Naomi Oreskes. I'm a professor of history of science at the University of California, San Diego, and I'm the co-author with Eric Conway of Merchants of Doubt. Right now, I find it hard to know what to say about climate change. We know the climate is changing. Scientists have known that for more than 20 years, and I think the polls show that the rest of us pretty much know it too. But we find ourselves politically paralyzed, unable to act, because a significant part of the leadership of the American country, including one whole political party, is in denial about the reality of this problem and is telling what at this point in history I believe can only be described as lies. The lie that climate change isn't happening, the lie that we don't know what's causing it, the lie that we can't do anything about it. But these are lies because we know they're not true. So why do people say these things? They say them to protect a worldview, the worldview that says that the free market can solve all of our problems. And so they resist taking action against climate change because it would require us to address a fundamental market failure. Some people have recently taken to calling climate change a wicked problem, but I don't think the problem is wicked. I think what's wicked is people who are willing to risk the health, well-being, livelihood, and prosperity of all of us simply to protect a worldview and, of course, to protect their own wealth. Shame on them. That's what I think is wicked, and that's what I think we need to have the courage to say.
So there's some pretty strong words. I want to ask you the first question, Andrea, because you kind of mentioned this before the break. We know that emission cuts are technically feasible and even economically feasible, but politically, do you think that they're possible?
Yes.
You do?
Everything is possible. Everything is possible.
Okay.
Look, at this point, we're not really talking about, mitigating as much as we're talking about adapting, because we're so far down the road. Where I think we get stuck is partly based in just human nature. We're really good at denial. This is how we're built. We wouldn't have survived all these, years if we hadn't have figured out how to sort of get through tough times and not think about just how ugly it is. And the big thing I have to say is, important as it is everything we're talking about here, it's a major bummer outer, right? Mm-hmm. Everything we're saying right now is like you want to slash your wrists. And this is partly what needs to be done, because I don't think science has really, taken hold, especially in the US, in the way that it needs to, for people to understand the whole system's approach to what's going on. But beyond that, I just think people have tuned out, because it's always bad news, and it's horrifically bad news, and exponentially bad news every day. So I actually think that's not popular. It kind of goes against the grain of human nature to be sort of in denial about things that are ugly or tough or require big changes. But it's bizarre to me that we have gotten this far down the road, politically or otherwise, and not really done anything.
Well, and it keeps coming back to this kind of section of the population, and I know that they're no longer the majority, but they still have so much monetary and political power that flat out deny, A, that climate change exists at all, that it's not just some normal fluctuation that we would expect to see, or B, that it's anthropogenic, that humans have anything to do with it. And that's insane to me. I mean, this quote specifically, he's not flat out denying it, but we have seen evidence of him doing so in the past. But those of you who watched the RNC this week, you saw that Mitt Romney said in his speech, President Obama promised to begin to slow the rise of the oceans and to heal the planet. My promise is to help you and your family. As if those things are mutually exclusive, because your family is going to be so well off when they're underwater.
But it's short-term thinking, because we're thinking about this week or the next election cycle. We're not thinking about the planet really in 100 years. And actually, I don't know how, you go, if you're in a business that's there to sort of harm, like say the fossil fuel industry, which we all use, right? But at the end of the day, you're not doing a good thing for the planet. You come home and you look at your kid in the face and you say, hey, how's your day today? Good luck having a planet in a couple of years. This is not the way we're thinking. We're being ridiculously selfish about it.
And it's very difficult for young kids coming up today to not just feel completely pessimistic.
Well, I mean, George Bush, the first George Bush, said, we're not going to change American lifestyle. And that's exactly what needs to happen. It's really thinking about what kind of lifestyle changes are we going to make individually, but what kind of lifestyle changes are we going to make systemically. So in that instance, yeah, we can actually start transferring and moving out of the fossil fuel, oil, gas, coal, right? There's no such thing as clean coal, moving out nuclear and really thinking about what systemic change could look like, wind, solar, renewable energy.
But that's the problem. Does everybody out there know that there is no such thing as clean coal?
Oh yeah.
That coal cannot be clean.
It depends who you listen to. And
exactly.
There's good marketing. There's a lot of money behind the marketing.
That's a huge issue. And I think, you know, fundamentally, again, it comes down to governmental regulation. This is why we need regulatory practices, because if we left the corporations in the free market to their own devices, the profit motive is going to be the only thing that drives them. And is there not, you know, just an exclusivity, a mutual exclusivity between a profit motive and a healthy world?
But where is the public in this? Like, why? That's what I love what 350.org is doing, what McKibben is rabble-rousing again, because it's not just pushing a button saying I like, or, you know, something on Facebook. We're literally going outside the White House and getting arrested again, which is awesome. We haven't seen that kind of passion in a long time. And considering the global scale of this and how ugly the consequences are, truthfully, why aren't all of us actually like banging down the president's door right now? Why are we just sort of sitting around bitching about it?
Because, I mean, do you think that banging on the president's door is as effective as pouring money into a PAC?
No, but it does have a presence. In other words, we're kind of a muted public. Especially
it does change public opinion. It changes public perception.
We need to think about what it looks like to rebuild a movement, right? An independent social movement. Because if the Democrats aren't making a move, the Republicans sure definitely aren't making a move. So there needs to be an independent force, a social force that's actually going to push. It's true. 1,200 people got arrested to stop Keystone XL, the tar sands pipeline coming from Canada on through the States in some of the biggest water reservoirs into the Delta, right? That stopped, but as you can see, every chance they got, the Republicans were trying to put Keystone into the transportation bill and restating it in all kinds of places, right? So there needs to be some real movement, but the rest of the globe is moving, right? The rest, you've got farmers that are in India, Bangladesh that are organizing. You've got landless people all throughout Brazil trying to raise the issue around food sustainability and what's going to take to actually heal the planet and feed its people. Yeah. So I do think that it comes down to there's a real luxury that we have here in the United States to be able to not worry about it, to not really think about changing American lifestyle.
Because we can turn on the faucet and just water always comes out of it. No matter what, there's just always water in the faucet. You know what I mean? These kinds of things don't permeate this armor, this bubble that we have living in the U.S. Bill, you've been very quiet. I wanted to ask you because we keep...
Here's the primary issue here is that I'm always concerned because money talks and science walks. Now why is that? Is that the special interest groups have such a powerful hold. Now, we've seen there was a Supreme Court decision recently that allowed the special interests like big oil unfettered contributions to political parties in this country. Mm-hmm. And so the end result was Mitt Romney's acceptance speech, where he poo-pooed and actually made fun of global warming, environmental science, and these issues. And so, you know, there really has to be strong leadership, political leadership, from below and from above, as this can't continue, really.
What about on the Democratic side, though? I mean, you said that you were, you know, we watched the Democratic National Convention. Today, we're recording this before it comes out, so we've only been able to see one day's worth of the DNC. No mention so far of the environment at all.
Yeah, well, that's embarrassing. That is embarrassing on the part of both parties, all right? Because I think we have made the case here, and our guest video speakers have made the guess, that this is a compelling issue. The future of civilization is really in the balance here, all right? And so how do we take back the planet, take back the political system in this country, all right? Mm-hmm. And I think we do that from above. We need stronger political leadership. You know, I see in the state of California or in the city of Los Angeles, there is a lot of lip service and there is actually movement, but we don't see it at the national level. And so somehow we have to take back this planet, all right, and save it from these large special interests like the Koch brothers or big oil.
Yeah, but so long as this feels like a bipartisan issue, it's going to divide us. You know, how do we get through to a group of people who deny science fundamentally?
No, you know, it's easy to blame the politicians, all right?
But or the voters.
Yeah, it takes, you know, this is a full press issue, mm-hmm. all right? We need business leaders that finally accept the fact that alternate energy will be profitable, all right? We need politicians that will give us spiritual and intellectual guidance, all right? And of course, we have the scientists. They're definitely on board. I'm not too worried about them.
But they're not vocal enough.
But here's a fourth one that people tend to neglect. Probably the biggest force for good and awareness on the planet, even though I'm not a very spiritual person, are religious leaders. All right? If we can't
I might disagree with what you said there, but I think I know where you're going.
That if we can't get politicians, scientists, economic leaders, and religious leaders on board here, we do really need the full press. Don't underestimate the power of spiritualism.
I think there's a lot of folks that actually need to make movement. The last results show that there is huge support for taking on the coal fossil fuel industry. So Bernie Sanders has a bill that said, let's just cut all subsidies to coal, gas, and oil. That's one concrete thing we can do.
Do we have any estimates of what that will actually do for
$100 billion.
But what about a cut in emissions? Like, do we know how that's going to affect the amount of carbon that we're pumping into the atmosphere? I mean, it seems like it would be probably one of the biggest things we could do in the next few years.
That's one of the biggest chunks. And I think the other thing that we should be worried about is the growing commodification of nature. So carbon's going to have a price tag on it. Water is going to have a price tag on it. We're having Wall Street basically the whole point is they're just going to be, it's going to be a next big bubble, derivatives, all those things that economists are talking about. Everything of nature that should be free are going to have price tags on it. That's really scary. So for our listeners,
especially for Americans, yeah.
Well, yeah.
It should have always been the idea that it's a free market. It was always free to just take and pillage and whatever you kind of wanted.
Exactly.
We never really accounted
These are already
for
commodities in third world countries,
just didn't
but
pay
we're not.
for it.
Yeah,
We
we're
had
not
free
used to
lunch.
that. Exactly. I want to kind of switch gears a little bit to show this graphic that comes from a paper that I read recently, and I reference it every time I talk about climate change. It's actually out of Nature Climate Change in April 2012. Markowitz and Sheriff wrote this paper, Climate Change and Moral Judgment, which I think is a really interesting approach. And they basically talk about 6 psychological challenges that are posed by climate change to the human moral judgment system, and then they bring up 6 psychological strategies that communicators, people like us, people who are outspoken about needing to affect change in climate science can use to show people that this is a moral imperative that we need to affect change. So the challenges that are posed, they mention abstractness and cognitive complexibility. It's a complicated issue and people don't really understand it. That makes it very easy to ignore it. They talk about the blamelessness of unintentional action. Well, if I don't do anything about it, it's not really my fault. It's easy for me to kind of wipe my hands of it. They talk about guilty bias. The more that we talk about climate change as being something that we are causing, the more people want to plug their ears to it because they don't want to feel guilty in their day-to-day lives. That uncertainty breeds wishful thinking. If we're not so sure, this is where the whole thing comes from. Is it anthropogenic? Is it not? I don't know. The scientists don't always agree, so maybe there's a chance. Come on, let's get real. They talk about moral tribalism, which is what we're really talking about here, politicization, having completely different opinions across the aisle, and a disconnect with timescale and faraway locale of victims, which we mentioned in the first segment. This is only happening to those Bangladeshis, it doesn't affect me, which is just such an American mentality. And so I want you guys' opinion, y'all's opinion. I'm from Texas. I don't need to drop that because I'm on air.
You must have been very lonely.
I want y'all's opinion on the strategies that they came up with here for how we communicators can change this kind of moral view. Use existing moral values, piggyback off of what people already believe. Message the costs, not the benefits. Stop talking about this as a warm and fuzzy thing and, oh, look what you're going to do for your children, and talk about how your children are going to die unless you make this change and that change. Appeal to hope, pride, and gratitude, not guilt, shame, and anxiety.
But aren't those two things kind of...
a little bit. They really are, I think, somewhat contradictory. Be wary of extrinsic motivators like profit. This one sticks out to me, and I want to get to that in a second. Also, expand group identity. This is this whole, let's get rid of that across the aisle view and say, we're all people living on the freaking planet, and none of us want to boil. And lastly, highlight positive social norms. I'm not really sure what they mean. That seems like a throwaway. But this one I want to come back to. Be wary of intrinsic motivators like profit. This seems to be the approach that a lot of people want to take in the political sphere. How do we have a profit motive for greening up your business?
Well, look at it this way. And the insurance companies were very early adapters to climate change because they knew they'd have to foot the bill for all the hurricanes and floods and droughts and everything else, and they are.
And medical insurance too.
Yeah, so if we actually add up what those numbers are, they're significant and they're growing and they're unpredictable. So I'd love to see what the comparisons are between predicting what the insurance costs will be versus actually doing something now so we don't have these massive fires and floods. They're sort of the extremes that we've been going to.
Can I say, how sad is it though, that we have to figure out how to incentivize something like having a healthy planet and being able to live for future generations? That people are more concerned about the monetary value.
$27 trillion is what that he's talking about in terms of that gigatons, is what the oil companies are going to be sitting on, burning. That's why it's such a big
But
number.
it's insane. $27 trillion weighing down your pockets means nothing when you're a corpse. Like, it's just insane to me that people can't wrap their heads around that concept.
I mean, what we've been talking here has been hopeful. It's about, we have real alternatives on the table that we can move on, right? If we can get the political will. And that it requires us to actually create movements to do that. Right? There's individual things that we can do, but we're talking, like, the thing that we need to be really clear about is we need to think about what are large-scale changes. And if this conversation hasn't been compelling, what we're talking about is real human, this is the survival of the planet, but also that if we care about what, not just the next generation, our generation, but other people that we need to share the planet with, that's one of the biggest things that I got. Anytime I leave this country, I mean, it's always, what are we going to do about the United States? And there's a huge responsibility for those of us who live here.
Right? You hide sitting there in the...
And also like the level of our social movements, our governments, But then there's also the other side of me that says, no, we actually could fight for something better. And that we have to create the will both within ourselves, but also movements here that there actually could be change. So it's necessary.
So for the people, go ahead, Bill, sorry.
Yeah, well, let me say that I've lived longer, so I've done more damage than the three of you.
Don't be too sure about that.
Maybe not. But rather than a lecture in sociology is what we just had a minute ago.
Don't blame me, I didn't write it. I just read it. Don't shoot the messenger.
I like to tell everybody, when it comes to climate change, all right, in environmental stewardship, there are no saints, all right? Everybody has done a little damage. Some people have done more damage, all right? And so we should get away from finger pointing at people, all right? And move ahead in a positive way in terms of trying to work with politicians, work with business, all right? Because alternative energy can be very, very, very profitable, all right? And you guys poo-pooed me a little bit, but don't underestimate the power of working with religious leaders and the force of spirituality.
I'm sorry, I shouldn't have said it.
All right?
It's hard. I'm an atheist. I hear that word and I plug my ears, but I feel you.
Still want to finger point at the fossil fuel industry.
And don't make fun of geeks.
No, don't.
They're saving the planet. Are you kidding?
So on that note, I do want to ask kind of each of you, maybe you can make some suggestions to the people that are watching today. What are some actionable changes, both at the individual level and I think the policy level, that they can do so that they can feel like they are contributing to helping change global climate change, to helping kind of mitigate it? What are some things that people can do today?
Well, okay, I'm going to sound a little kumbaya here, but I'll go for it. Which is, this is the idea that this is hopeless. I think is what's sitting with people, especially younger generation. Nothing we've talked about here makes me feel super hopeful.
Yeah,
that's what I think, and you need the anger. You need to be pissed off that this is happening. And the fossil fuel industries are doing this to us, and politicians aren't acting when they need to. Yeah, pissed. But at the same time, that's a motivator, but you also need people to be as part of the movement, and they have to be somewhat hopeful, I think, to do it.
And how do they get involved in that movement?
I think, personally, again, I'll say I'm kumbaya, but I'll do it. Go outside. I mean, this is the hippie in me talking. We're in a studio, we're in front of our computers. I studied environmental studies in college. It was one thing to do that, then go out in the field and work in it and hear spotted owls and know, oh, this is what I'm trying to protect. It's very different when it's tangible, when you can be there and realize, oh, I'm a part of this system, I'm not separate. Hippie, but true.
Well, look, we've talked about lots of things that could be done. ending subsidies to oil. I think building the public transportation sector. Not just are we talking about reducing automobile emissions, but we're talking about jobs. So climate jobs in terms of direct, indirect, and residual jobs from public transportation. You get more jobs by building public transportation than you do highways and roads, right? I do also find hope in resilience projects like Detroit that's taken really, unused lots and really thinking about urban sustainability and urban farming, right? Those are things that people can do at a community level.
Yeah.
They're movements that could happen. I'm really excited about some movements that are happening in Richmond where it's taking on Chevron by organizations like the Asian Pacific Environmental Network and Communities for a Better Environment. There's tons of organizations people can join, right?
These are tangible things that people, individual people can do.
They can come and join the bus riders union. They can, they can join. There's all kinds of things that people can do on a local level from urban farming, but I'm also thinking about what you heard Bill McKibben talk about. Let's take on the fossil fuel industry. You heard Cara talk about let's move beyond free market systems, right? And really think about what's sustainable.
Naomi.
Well, you heard about what that's right. You heard about what Cara said around not moving to think that free markets can solve it, right? So what are real concrete changes we can make? So these are all things that people can do. And what we need is folks in the streets. So we need real movements, whether you talk about 350.org or Grassroots Global Justice Alliance. We need to get folks in the streets pushing on both the parties to start making some action.
Hallelujah.
And what do you think, Bill?
Well, I think it's always good to read a book. All right? And one of my favorite books is Tom Friedman's book, is Hot, Flat, and Crowded. And it really says a lot.
Yeah.
We all agree that the world is warmer, it's melting, sea levels are rising. The world economy is fundamentally changed. We're all closer together. We're all interconnected. Now remember, there's 7 billion people on the planet, and there's 5.6 billion cell phones, all right? And so young people, old people, men, women, different religions, we're all connected now, through all kinds of goofy things like Twitter and Facebook, all right? And there's a tremendous potential there, all right? And we're crowded, all right? There's an awful lot of us. There's 7 billion headed for 10 billion. And if we don't slow population growth, none of this is going to make any difference. And so I'm going to be a hero here. What's the best thing we can do to slow population growth, ladies?
Stop making babies.
Stop shagging.
Oh, you ladies are so primitive. But no, the fundamental thing that we could do is increase educational and economic opportunities for women.
Birth control.
All right? And so the solution to this problem is a woman's issue, all right? And so I'm pretty optimistic, all right?
Yeah, I think we're seeing a lot of change in that.
And so,
especially with California being 47th in spending for education.
Well, on that note, I want to thank you guys for joining me. And so go ahead and tell people where they can find out about what you do. Andrea Robinson?
arcsustainability.com.
Okay.
www.thestrategycenter.com.
And that's Tammy Bang Luu. Again, sorry about that. And Bill Patzert.
Yeah, you just go to jpl.nasa.gov, and we're doing fantastic things at JPL.
Go Mars
Not only
rover.
on this planet,
Yeah.
but on Mars.
I also want to thank our Point contributors, Bill McKibben, Chris Field, and Naomi Oreskes. I'm Cara Santa Maria. You can find me on Facebook and Twitter at Cara Santa Maria. You can also go to carasantamaria.com and see my column on Huffington Post Science called Talk Nerdy to Me. Thanks, everyone. Don't forget to leave comments below.
My view is that we don't know what's causing climate change on this planet. And the idea of spending trillions and trillions of dollars to try and reduce CO2 emissions is not the right course for us.
And so I think it's important for us to reduce our emissions of pollutants and greenhouse gases that may well be significant contributors to the climate change and the global warming that you're seeing.